Yeah, so we've got an Ohio State-Clemson matchup, as I mentioned, for the third time in 5 years in the playoff era. The game was considered to be generally a toss-up the first two times. Clemson's a pretty substantial favorite for a playoff game, unless you look at that other playoff game that's being played that's pretty monumental. But 7.5 points, it's ballooned to, as Clemson obviously won last year's game. Ohio State didn't feel real good about the outcome of that in regards to it being a bit tainted. Dabo Swinney ranks them 11th in the coaches poll. A lot of prognosticators out there think that the point spread's justified, and even picking Clemson to win by a bigger margin than that. There just seems to be a whole lot playing into more than just the typical playoff motivation.
You're right. It's been an interesting week with kind of everything since, really a week and a half now, since the matchups were announced. Whether you want to start with Dabo's coaches poll ballot coming out, or some of the comments he made about not having enough or having such little film to watch on Ohio State. That's certainly thrown fuel to the fire. But, I think that's more something that I write about, that people that do my job write about, that fans talk about and get fired up. I think these two teams respect each other. I think that they know that both teams are talented, then that it should be a good matchup. Now, the spread, I think, is a reflection on, the limited ability to watch Ohio State this year. And that's not to say that it's not warranted, but that, Ohio State has had such an off and on last month plus. It's been hard for the Buckeyes to get into a rhythm. And I think the last couple games you've seen, 2 out of the last 3 games, you've seen Justin Fields struggle. You saw Ohio State's pass defense against, as we've talked about numerous times, against the only, real true passing offense struggle. And so there's just not enough of a sample size to say, despite how talented Ohio State might be, player per player, to say, okay, well, they can clearly match up with Clemson here, here, and here, because we've seen them do it with X team or Y team. It doesn't help that Penn State had a really down season. So, going back to that game, which at the time was considered a pretty good win, isn't viewed as much that Ohio State didn't play a Michigan team that at the end of the season that they usually do, that is usually kind of a benchmark game, even in years where the Wolverines aren't maybe a top 10 team. So, I think all of that combined together has kind of made that spread where it is. And I think that it's on Ohio State now to go out and prove, Dabo Swinney's comments wrong, that, 6 games, this is still one of the best teams in the country. You do that by winning. And you prove the people that doubted you wrong as well. So, if you needed any more motivation from a player coach standpoint, I think you certainly have it. But, I think these guys are just fired up to be back, especially playing Clemson. Let's not forget, how disappointed this team was, as you mentioned, losing last year, the 6 points, 6-point game on that interception late. Ohio State still remembers the calls that went against them in that game and how that whole thing played out, not scoring touchdowns early that kind of cost them in the end. So, there's a lot of things you can pull from for motivation if you're Ohio State, but I think the most is just they want to win this game because they want to play for a national championship. That's been a goal from the beginning of the season.
If recent history has anything to say, Buckeye fans can, of course, take a bit of solace in the last time Ohio State was this kind of a underdog, because if you look at the Buckeyes' schedule year to year, they're typically not an underdog the entire season, maybe once, rarely twice, typically once, 0 times. We got to go back to the 2014 season, the 15 Sugar Bowl against Alabama as a 10-point underdog, winning, of course, en route to a national championship. All right, we got Pat Murphy on the line talking Ohio State football with Clemson and the semifinal from the Sugar Bowl coming up, of course, on New Year's Day. It starts with Lawrence versus Fields. If somebody told me the Clemson won, I wouldn't be surprised. If somebody tells me Ohio State wins, I won't be surprised. There just seems to be more question marks on the Ohio State column than there does for Clemson, and that seems to be where Clemson has this advantage with perception.
Yeah, I agree. I think that because a lot of that because Ohio State just hasn't played enough games to get a good read on this team. 6 games is normally halfway through a regular season where a team is still figuring itself out. If you go back and look at Clemson's schedule, 6 games in, I think they were in a bit of a dogfight in that game. Then the next week they played Boston College, where they had to come from behind, obviously without Trevor Lawrence. And then the following week was when they lost to Notre Dame, if I have the schedule correct. So, they were still figuring themselves out 6 games in the season. And I think Ohio State is. And I think that's why there are questions. And I think those questions are justified. We just don't know enough about this Ohio State team, this year's group, to say, oh, yes, this team can hang with Clemson. And I think they can hang with Clemson, but beat Clemson. And you say that confidently. How will this secondary hold up against Justin Fields and these receivers? Obviously, they did a good job last year, but it's a whole different group. I mean, there were 2 first-rounders and another guy who was probably underdrafted in that secondary. Sean Wade was a part of it for a little over half, or a little less than half the game, but he was playing a different position. So this is an opportunity, though, for those guys to show up and do it. And as I said on another thing I was on earlier this week, if you're Ohio State and you want to prove that the 6 games that you play don't matter, there's a good way to do it. Beat Clemson, and then hope you play Alabama in the national championship game and beat them, because no one's going to say anything about an 8-0 Ohio State that beat both Clemson and Alabama to win a national championship. So I think there's a way to kind of shut up the doubters if you can beat both of these teams and look the part as a team that was a top 2-3 team coming into the season.
Yeah, I also think that having beaten teams that are 6-1 and 6-2, named Indiana and Northwestern, if those were somehow replaced by Penn State and Wisconsin, same exact teams, performance, everything, people would just look at it differently.
Agreed. I think so too.
Pat Murphy, Bucknuts, 247 Sports. Please join him in the work that he does there and the rest of the staff there at Bucknuts. Pat, hopefully we get together next week talking about a game against Alabama, possibly Notre Dame.
Right. Yes, hopefully that would be good. It would mean I still have things to write about.